Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to wrap up all of my eyeshadow usage for the second quarter of the year. If you don't know, this year I'm doing kind of an unofficial, like, no pan left behind kind of style, where I want to use every single eyeshadow in my collection. So I'm tracking all my usage and seeing what eyeshadows I've used every month and so on. So that's kind of what I'm tracking in this video. So I did a video for this already in Q1 and that's up on my channel if you want to check that one out. And I cover there all the palettes I reached for and all the eyeshadows that I used, and also like percentage, stats, all of that kind of fun stuff. So if you want to check that out first, that would be better because I do cover a few more things in there. But today I'm going to cover Q2. But before I jump into the actual palettes that I reached for, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's just jump into the video. So I'm going to start by going through the actual palettes that I reached for. I don't have nearly as many as I did in the first month, unless I think, or in the first quarter. And I think that's because of two reasons. First of all, I am not counting palettes that I've used in both months. So for example, my Panda palette, I of course used all the shades in the first quarter, and I have been using them now as well, but they are tracked as like first quarter usage because that's when I reached for the first time. So if there's shades that I reach for both quarters, I do not count them into quarter two because it's just simpler for me in that way with my spreadsheets and things like that and stats. So this is only kind of new palettes or new shades that I've reached for that count into Q2. Secondly, I have been quite overwhelmed with eyeshadows in the second quarter of the year. I have been doing, like, for example, higher levels with my product level up, which means that I reach for a shadow like 3-4 uses per palette, which is a bit more, and that has taken up a lot more time. So I went through like level 1, 2 very quickly, for example, with my product level up, and that meant that I had 2 full use palettes in Q1 very rapidly, whereas like in the second quarter it has been a bit slower. So I think stuff like that also affects it. And I also kind of stopped doing my BYOP earlier in, I don't know when I did the last one. Was it maybe in April or May? Yeah, it's been quite a while since I did one. So I think that's also affecting my usage, especially on my singles. I'm gonna try to start doing it again. I think I'm gonna try to do one this month. I don't know if this one actually might be up after that is supposed to be up. So if I manage to film it this month, it should already be up, I think. So hopefully that will again help me reach for my singles a bit more in the upcoming quarter. But that is basically the introduction. Let's just jump through the palettes that I reached for in the last 3 months. So let's start with the first palette, which is my Anastasia Soft Glam. This palette I had in my whole collection for pan, and I hit pan on the shade Glistening up here. And while I had it in, I tried to reach for a couple of shades. I know that I reached for majority of the top row, and I reached for Fairy as well, I think. I reached for a couple of shades in here, not every shade, but probably like half or so of the shades I've reached for. I'm definitely going to pull this out again and reach for the rest of the shades sometime this year, but I do have a little bit of use on this palette, and that is the first palette I used this quarter. Next up we have my Project Level Up palette, and that is the Subculture palette. If you haven't seen my last update, go check that out first before you look at the rest of the video, because I am going to get spoilers. But I did reach for every single shade in this palette in that project, and this is what my palette looks now. So this one is completely used, and that was the second palette that I reached for in this quarter. Lastly, for Anastasia palettes, we have my Draki Aina palette. I'm currently working on one of these shades again in my whole collection project pan, which is the shade Lithuanian right here. So far I have reached for a couple of the shades in here. I reached for Lithuanian, I reached for Trust Issues, Sam Soleil as well, I think. So like these two here, this one, and then the one I'm working on. I do want to reach for a few more shades in here, but I recently pulled that one in, so it hasn't been in for too long. So hopefully while I work on that one, I can reach for the rest of the palette as well. So hopefully we'll see this again in Q3. So next up we have some ColourPop palettes. We have 2 that I reached for in the past quarter. The first one is the Lilac You A Lot palette. I'm currently working on one of the shades, which is why it's missing, and that's the shade Imagine That, which is more of a mauve tone. I've obviously reached for that one, and so far I've also reached for Cloud, which is the shade here, and the center shade, which is Fluff. So those 2 I've also reached for. Again, I do want to reach for the remaining palette while I'm working on Imagine That, and hopefully I can do that as well, but I did reach for this one in the past quarter. And then the second ColourPop palette that I reached for is my Through My Eyes palette. Again, I'm working on one of the shades in here, which is Sandalwood, and that one is in here again. It's like a really light kind of brown sandy transition shade. And I do believe that's actually the only shade that I reached for in this palette so far. So because I took it out in my magnetic palette, and since then I just put this palette back because it's a bit of a bigger palette. And it's been in my kind of storage with all my other palettes, but I need to put this into my everyday rotation so I can reach for the rest of the shades while I'm working on that eyeshadow. And because I think a lot of these can be quite easy to reach for. I mean, you have some really nice neutral shimmers, which I always reach for. Some more kind of mattes. I think some of these mattes will go really well with a pan palette as well. So I need to reach for more shades in here, but so far I only reached for one. Next up we have like a kind of miscellaneous palette, and that is my Juvia's Place Magic mini palette. I reached for every single shade in this palette as well. That was my Product Level Up level 3 palette. I didn't reach for all of the shades in this past quarter because it was kind of like my level up palette between quarter 1 and 2, so I've already completed some of them in quarter 1, but by quarter 2 I have now reached for every single shade in this palette, so this one is done as like a no pan left behind style. Next up we have two palettes that I'm very happy with that I've reached for in the last quarter, and that is two Natasha Denona palettes. The first one is my Natasha Denona Sunrise palette. This one I've reached for every single shade in. It was in my deck of panning with the goal of using every single shade. So this one is done as in that sense as well, with no pan left behind. I'm definitely going to reach for this a bit more though, because it's like the perfect kind of summer autumn palette, so I think this is the perfect time of year to reach for it. And yeah, I think I'm going to play around with this more. But again, since it's now completed with using every single shade, if I do use more in Q3, you won't see it in Q3's video because it's already like completed when it comes to like no pan left behind. But I did use every single shade in this palette, which I'm very excited about. Then the second Natasha Denona palette that I reached for in the last quarter is my Natasha Denona Love palette. I'm so excited that I finally reached for this one because I picked this up at the very tail end of last year, and I had not used it at all before, but I did reach for it in the last quarter. And I'm currently working on the shade Commitment, which is why it's missing, but that's a really kind of deep plummy shade. And I'm actually wearing some of these shades today. I'm wearing the shade Dream down here, I'm wearing Trust up here, and that's kind of like my outer corner and crease shade. And I've also reached for Lifetime First, Soul down here, and I think one of these like shimmers here in the center, like the more purpley pink ones. But I do want to reach for the rest of the shades in here as well. I think that's going to be no problem at all, especially since I'm working on Commitment. But I'm excited to have reached for this palette now and to be getting some use out of this one. But expect to see more of this palette in Q3's video when I reach for the rest of the shades. We have two more palettes to go. The first one is my Huda Beauty Gold palette. This is the Gold Obsessions. I was working on this bottom shade here in my whole collection Pretty Pan, and I did hit my goal on that. But while I was working on that, I reached for every single shimmer in the palette. So I reached for all of the shades apart from the 3 mattes, which is actually no, I did reach for this top matte here. So I reached for every single shade apart from 2, which are this matte here and this matte here. So those are the only 2 I have left to reach for in this palette. And again, hopefully I can do that in the next quarter, and then this one would also be complete. Then the very final palette that I'm reached for in this quarter is my Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette. This one I'm currently working on in my deck of panning, similarly to the Sunrise palette with no pan left behind. And I have reached for a handful of these shades so far. I have reached for Frazzled, Gold Glitch, Libra, Galaxy, Off Balance I believe, and Cosmic possibly. So I reached for a couple of these, but not all of them. I think I may be like a third through. So again, this will definitely be in Q3's video when I reach for the rest of the shades, but I did reach for this palette in the last quarter. So not as many palettes that I reached for in the last quarter as the first one. In the first one I reached for 17 palettes, in the last quarter I reached for 10. But again, it's because some of the palettes did overlap. But yeah, 10 of my 39 palettes was used in the quarter 2, and that is 25.6%. So that's still pretty good, especially since I mean, there's 4 quarters, so if I did use about 10 palettes each month, I would hit my goal of using every single palette in the year. And in total, so far in the year, I have reached for 24 out of my 39 palettes, and that's 61.5%. So that's definitely more than half, and I'm very happy with that. At least I reached for, at least I'm on track with reaching for every single palette this year. So that is kind of my palette stat. Let's move on to the number of eyeshadows used. When it comes to eyeshadows in palettes, in the second quarter of the year I reached for 53 eyeshadows out of 541, and that is 9.8%, which is definitely not as high as I would want it to be. I ideally want it to be much higher than that. I'm definitely behind when it comes to eyeshadow usage. but at least I did use for 10%, which is I can reach for 10% of my eyeshadows, which is really good. And in total so far in the year I've reached for 151 eyeshadows in palettes out of 541, which means 27.9%. so again, I'm behind. I should be around 50%, obviously, because we're halfway through the year. So I need to start rotating through my palettes more often and reaching for shades that might not be in projects, just in order to reach that goal of using every single eyeshadow by the end of the year. I'm not sure if I will be able to reach for it, but if I can just reach for as many eyeshadows as possible, I'll be very, very happy. But that is where I am now. When it comes to singles, I've only reached for 15 singles in the past month, which again is very low compared to the first month, or first quarter, sorry. And that is only 4.5%, so again, not great, and that is definitely affected by me not doing my BYOP. So hopefully again that will be a higher number by Q3, because I will start doing that palette again. So in total I reached for 68 out of my 331 singles this year, which is 20.5%. so again, not great, but I did, you know, I have reached for a fifth of my eyeshadows in singles, which is really good. So it's more than, you know, I might have been doing in other previous years, but I wished it was higher. So just to sum up, in total in this quarter I reached for 68 new individual eyeshadows, like new that I hadn't reached for previously, out of 872, which is 7.8%. And in total so far this year I've reached for 219 different eyeshadows out of 872, and that is 25.11%. so I'm I'm a fourth of the way through reaching for all of my eyeshadows, so I'm definitely behind, like I said, but I'm okay with that, because I think previously, like in previous years, I haven't really reached for nearly as many. Let me pull up my laptop and I'll see like what I've done in previous years. So I've actually been tracking my eyeshadow usage for the last 2 years, not on video but just by myself. And in 2020 I only used for I reached for 175 different eyeshadows, which is 32.2%, so only about a third of my collection I reached for that year. Then in 2021 I reached for 272 eyeshadows, which was 34.9%, so 35%, so just over a third. So judging from that, I'm already way ahead of that, because I would like, if I continue reaching eyeshadows like I have been, I would hit 50% by the end of the year, which is obviously way higher than I have done in previous years. So even if I don't hit 100%, I mean 50% is still very successful compared to other years. So I'm very happy with where I am currently, but I just need to remember to rotate through eyeshadows a bit more. I definitely was stuck at the beginning of the quarter just kind of focusing on things that I was panning, because I was very overwhelmed with the amount of eyeshadows that I was panning. But then towards the last bit of the quarter, like the last, I don't know, even just 2 weeks, I started to realize that I hadn't really reached for many eyeshadows at all in the quarter. So I started to rotate and like incorporate like just 1 or 2 eyeshadows here and there in looks from other palettes, in order to get that number higher. And I think that was quite successful, so that's going to be my game plan moving forward, is just to, you know, still work on eyeshadows that I'm panning, but incorporate things that I, you know, am not panning, or eyeshadows in palettes where I have one shadow that I'm panning, if that makes sense. Like for example today, like my crease is from the Love palette, which I'm not panning them, but I do want to reach for every single shade, so that's what I did today. And I still used 2 or 3 eyeshadows that I'm panning, which is still really good, you know. So I'm very happy about that, and you know, that's gonna be my game plan moving forward. So I'm gonna be very excited to see where I am at Q3, because I think I'm definitely gonna have better numbers by Q3 than I did now in Q2. So fingers crossed I can keep up with that. But that is basically the video today. Let me know if you're doing something similar. I know that Laura Force, she's doing something very similar. I saw her video, like by filming this, I actually watched the video today. Or was it yesterday? Very recently I watched the video, and it's really fun to do something like this. Like I said, I have been tracking my eyeshadow usage for the last like 2 years plus this year, so like since 2020, and it's just really interesting to see, and it just keeps you a bit more accountable. It makes you see like what palette do you actually reach for. Is there any palettes that you have like basically untouched shades? Is there any palettes that you haven't reached for in the last like 2 years? Stuff like that. And I think at the end of the year I'm going to use this spreadsheet and see what I've actually reached for, and by then, you know, decide what I want to keep, and if there's anything that I haven't reached for, like, you know, in the past 3 years or if I only reach for like 1 or 2 shades in the past 3 years, if there's anything that I can actually declutter, because I think if you haven't reached for it in such a long time, it is time to let go of. So it's very interesting to track, so I do recommend it if you do have like a makeup spreadsheet or anything like that, or if you just want to do it in your bullet journal, you know, stuff like that. I really recommend it if you are into planning and stats, because it's been really fun to track this year. But that is it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and otherwise I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys.